"You have been up since before dawn again," he said, and the low certainty in his voice stopped her cold. Henrietta Langston's hand froze above the ledger, the ink-dipped pen hovering like a bird that had lost its nerve. The morning light was still gray and thin, barely enough to read by, and yet Samuel Underwood stood in the doorway of her office with his hat in his hands, and his eyes holding a secret she had not given him permission to carry. He was not surprised to find her there. He was not startled by the candle burned halfway down to its brass holder, or by the stack of contracts she had been negotiating for the better part of 3 weeks. He had known. He had been watching, and the knowledge of that sent something electric and terrifying rushing through her chest. "How long?" she asked, and her voice came out stripped of everything except the raw question. He stepped inside, and the floorboards of the Langston land office creaked under his boots. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, with hands that looked like they had spent equal time with a rope and a rifle, and eyes the precise color of a storm-bruised sky. He set his hat on the corner of her desk with a familiarity that had no business being there, and he looked at the open ledger without flinching. "Long enough to know you are trying to save something," he said. "Long enough to know you are losing." The betrayal she felt in that moment was not clean. It was not the simple, sharp thing she had expected if anyone ever discovered what she had been doing in the pre-dawn silence of Cassidy Creek, Texas, in the fall of 1882. It was layered and complicated and threaded through with something she absolutely refused to name, because naming it would make her more vulnerable than she had already allowed herself to become, and Henrietta Langston had not survived the last 2 years by allowing vulnerability. She closed the ledger. "Get out," she said. He did not move. "I said get out, Mr. Underwood. I know what you said." His voice was steady, untroubled, the way a man sounds when he has already decided something and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. "I also know that Harlan Creed has been buying up water rights along the Cimarron Bluff tract, and I know that 3 of your ranching contracts are going to collapse the moment he cuts off access to the creek that feeds your client's land. And I know," he added, quieter now, the words landing between them like something dropped from a great height, "that your father's name is on the deed of the most vulnerable parcel, and that if Creed gets it, you lose everything your family built." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Henrietta had heard since the night her father told her he was dying. This is where the story truly began. Not in that graylit morning in the land office, but 6 months earlier, when the ground had been summer-hard and the future had looked, if not bright, then at least navigable. Cassidy Creek was a town that had grown up the way most West Texas towns grew in the 1880s, which was to say fast, argumentatively, and with a great deal of dust. It sat at the meeting place of 2 cattle trails and 1 reliable creek, which made it valuable enough to fight over and populated enough to have 3 saloons, a proper church, a telegraph office, a school that ran 4 days a week, and a land office that had been operated by the Langston family for 11 years. Henrietta's father, George Langston, had built the office himself. He had carried the lumber in a wagon from San Antonio, mixed the mortar for the foundation with his own hands, and lettered the sign above the door in careful, deliberate strokes, "Langston Land and Title." He had also, in his later years, made a series of business decisions that a healthier man with more time to course-correct might have survived. George Langston had not had the time. He had been diagnosed with consumption in the spring of 1881, and had spent the better part of a year trying to hide it from his daughter and everyone else, which meant that by the time Henrietta truly understood the scope of what she was inheriting, she was already standing at the edge of a cliff. She was 26 years old when she took over the office. She had grown up in it, had learned to read from the surveys and plat maps her father stored in long wooden tubes along the north wall, had learned arithmetic from the ledgers, had learned the law from the cases her father described at dinner with the enthusiasm of a man who found the law genuinely beautiful. She was not unprepared. She was simply undercapitalized, and those are 2 very different problems. She had also, and this mattered more than she had initially acknowledged, inherited her father's enemies. Harlan Creed was 61 years old and had been accumulating land and grievances in equal measure for 40 of those years. He had arrived in this part of Texas before the town of Cassidy Creek even had a name, had built a cattle empire through a combination of genuine business acumen, strategic marriage to a woman who died young and left him her family's water rights, and a flexible relationship with legal boundaries that the understaffed courts of West Texas had never quite caught up with. He and George Langston had been adversaries in the specific, formal way that men become adversaries when they disagree about the nature of property and law, which is to say deeply, and with complete sincerity on both sides. When George died in January of 1882, Creed had sent flowers. Henrietta had not missed the implication. By March, Creed's lawyers had begun the slow, patient legal work of challenging the water rights provisions in 4 of the contracts her father had written for small ranchers along the Cimarron Bluff tract. It was sophisticated work, the kind that required time and money and a detailed knowledge of the gaps between territorial law and common practice, and Henrietta had understood immediately that if she did not respond with equal sophistication, those ranchers would lose their water access and their land would become worthless, and they would almost certainly sell to the only buyer left standing. She had not slept properly since February. The contracts she was drafting in the pre-dawn hours were her response. She had spent weeks researching the legal history of the water rights claims in question, writing to land law offices in Austin and Dallas, corresponding with a surveyor in San Antonio who had done work in the region 20 years earlier and still had his original notes. She had found 3 separate precedents that she believed would hold in court. She had also found something else, something darker and more dangerous, which was evidence that the deed at the center of Creed's legal strategy, the deed he was using as the foundation for his water rights claim, had been recorded with a date discrepancy that was either an error or a deliberate forgery. She had not yet decided what to do with that information. This was the problem she had been sitting with in the gray pre-dawn hours when Samuel Underwood appeared in her doorway and upended everything she thought she knew about the situation. She had met Samuel Underwood in April, though met was perhaps too casual a word for what had happened. He had walked into her office on a Wednesday afternoon with a land survey in one hand and a look on his face that suggested he had strong opinions about how surveys ought to be conducted, and he had proceeded to demonstrate those opinions in considerable and well-argued detail. He was a surveyor himself, recently arrived from New Mexico Territory, and he had come to Cassidy Creek under a contract from the county to re-examine several disputed boundary lines in the area west of town. The survey he had brought her was one of the surveys that touched on the Cimarron Bluff tract. They had argued for 40 minutes the first time they met. It had been the most intellectually stimulating conversation Henrietta had had since her father's health had declined enough to curtail his ability to engage in his beloved legal debates, and she had ended it feeling simultaneously irritated and exhilarated and deeply suspicious of both feelings. He had come back the next day with a correction to one of his calculations and an apology that was delivered with such mathematical precision that she had to appreciate the craftsmanship even while she mistrusted the intent. By the end of May, he had a desk in the corner of her office, technically because the county survey contract required him to work from the land records she housed, but actually, she was aware, because they had both tacitly decided that the arrangement suited them. He brought coffee in the mornings, strong and black and reliable. She occasionally remembered to eat lunch when he reminded her. They talked about surveys and property law and the particular injustice of a legal system that had been written in the East and was being applied in a landscape the writers had never seen, and neither of them said anything about the way the air in the small office changed when they were both in it. He had not told her he was watching her work in the pre-dawn hours. He had not told her he knew about the full scope of the crisis she was navigating. And that, she thought, sitting with her hand still pressed flat on the closed ledger in the gray morning light, was the question that mattered most right now. "How do you know about the Cimarron Bluff contracts?" she asked, and her voice had recovered its professional steadiness. "Those records are not part of your survey work." He met her eyes. "No," he said. "They are not. Then how?" He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding something, and she hated that she could read his silences that well after only a few months, because it meant the walls she had carefully maintained were not as solid as she had believed. "I grew up about 40 miles east of here," he said at last, "in a town called Marker's Bluff. My family had a small ranch. My father ran cattle, not many, but enough. When I was 17 years old, Harlan Creed bought the water rights to the creek that crossed our property. It was a legal purchase, or close enough to legal that we could not afford to fight it. 2 years later, we sold the ranch for a fifth of what it was worth because without the water we could not run cattle, and without the cattle we could not make the payments on the land loan." He paused. "I know what Harlan Creed does. I know how he does it. And when I came to Cassidy Creek and saw the survey work on the Cimarron Bluff tract, I recognized the pattern." Henrietta absorbed this. It reordered several things. "You did not tell me this when we met," she said. "No." "Why?" "Because I was not certain yet. Because I needed to look at the records myself. And because," he added, and here something shifted in his expression that was not quite embarrassment and not quite apology but was somewhere between them, "I was not sure you would trust the information if I led with a personal grievance." He was right about that, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it sat between them like a third presence in the room. "What have you found?" she asked. He reached into his coat and set a folded paper on the desk beside his hat. She did not open it immediately. She looked at him. "The deed discrepancy," she said. He blinked. Just once, very slightly, the only tell he had. "You already found it," he said, 3 weeks ago. "And you have not acted on it." "No." She finally unfolded the paper. It was a copy, carefully made in his precise surveyor's hand, of the original deed filing for the water rights claim Creed was using as his foundation. She looked at it, and then looked at the notation he had made at the bottom, which matched exactly the notation she had made in her own private record. "I have not acted on it because it is a very dangerous piece of information, and I want to be absolutely certain before I put it in front of a judge." "It is not an error," he said flatly. "I know it is not an error. Creed had that deed altered after the original filing. The date change is what allowed him to establish precedent over the neighboring claims." "I know," she said again, and she was aware that her voice had gone quiet in a particular way, that it went quiet when she was working very hard to keep something contained. "And if we bring this to Judge Harker at the fall term, and if it holds, Creed loses not just the current case, but the foundation of every water rights claim he has built on top of this deed for the past 15 years. The magnitude of that sat between them. That is a great many enemies to make at once," Samuel said. "It is the only way to stop it permanently." She set the paper down. "Half measures will not work with a man like Creed. Every lawyer I have consulted, and I have consulted several on various pretexts so as not to telegraph my strategy, agrees that a challenge to the water rights provision alone would take 3 to 5 years in the territorial courts, and by then my clients will have sold out and moved on, and there will be nothing left to protect." He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling experience, not for the first time, of feeling genuinely seen by someone she had not invited to see her. "You have been carrying this alone for how long?" he asked. "Since March. That is 6 months. I am aware. Henrietta." It was the first time he had used her given name without the miss preceding it, and they both noticed it, and neither of them addressed it directly, but it changed the atmospheric pressure of the room in a way that was impossible to ignore. "There is something else," she said, and she reached into the bottom drawer of her desk and withdrew a second folder. Inside it was a letter unsigned that had been slipped under her office door 2 weeks earlier. She set it on the desk and watched him read it. It read, "Stop the simmer and filing or lose more than the case." He read it twice, his jaw set in a way she had learned to recognize. "You received this and did not tell anyone," he said. "I told my client Thomas Birch, whose parcel is the most directly at risk, because he needed to know there might be personal danger involved, and he had the right to decide his own level of risk. I did not tell anyone else because the only people who know enough about my legal strategy to know what the simmer and filing is are the people who work for Creed, or people who have been watching your work." The words landed. She looked at him directly, and she let herself do the thing she had been refusing to do for 6 months, which was fully reckon with the possibility that Samuel Underwood, who had appeared in her town at a convenient moment with a convenient skill set, and who had inserted himself into her professional life with remarkable ease, might not be exactly what he appeared to be. "Are you working for Creed?" she asked. She made herself ask it cleanly without flinching. He did not look away. "No." "How am I supposed to believe that?" "Because if I were working for Creed, you would already be ruined." He said it without heat, simply as a matter of logic. "I have had access to your filing system for 4 months. I know your legal strategy in detail. I know about the deed discrepancy. If I had passed any of that to Creed, his lawyers would have moved to dismiss the entire case on procedural grounds by now, and you would have had no time to counter. You are still standing. The case is still viable. Whatever I have done with what I know, it has not been used against you." She could not argue with the logic. She hated that she could not argue with it. "That is a defense based on what you have not done," she said. "Yes, I know. I also know that it is not enough, and I am not going to tell you that you should trust me simply because I have asked you to. Trust me because of what I do next." He stood. He picked up his hat. "I am going to ride out to Marker's Bluff this morning and speak with the family that bought our old property. They have documentation of the original water rights arrangement that predates Creed's deed by 7 years. I have been in correspondence with them for the past month. They have agreed to provide affidavits. Combined with the deed discrepancy, it should be enough to bring to Judge Harker at the fall term with a realistic chance of success." She stared at him. "You have been building a parallel case," she said slowly. "I have been trying to make myself useful," he said, and the simplicity of it, the complete lack of performance in the way he said it, undid something in her chest that she had been holding shut for a very long time. He left. She sat in the gray morning light and pressed her hands flat on the desk and breathed carefully, deliberately, the way she had learned to breathe when her father was dying and she needed to stay functional. The letter was still on the desk. The folder of contracts was still open beside the ledger. The candle had burned down another 1/4 inch. She had been up since before dawn again, and Samuel Underwood had been watching her work, and the world was considerably more complicated than it had been 60 minutes ago. She was also, she admitted to herself with great reluctance, not entirely sorry about that. The ride to Marker's Bluff was 40 miles of hard West Texas terrain, and Samuel made it in a day and a half on his roan gelding, arriving in the small, tired-looking town on a Thursday evening when the light was going amber and long across the Mesquite Flats. The family he had come to see was named Coulter, an aging couple named Hiram and Beatrice who had bought the Underwood property 8 years ago, and had, to their considerable credit, managed to make it work despite the water rights situation by digging additional wells and negotiating an informal arrangement with a neighboring family for creek access during dry months. They received him at their kitchen table with coffee and cold biscuits, and the careful hospitality of people who have learned that visitors rarely bring good news but who have not yet given up on the possibility. He explained what he needed. Hiram Coulter was quiet for a long time, turning his coffee mug in his hands, and then he looked at his wife, and she looked back at him with a communication that required no words at all, and he nodded. "Your father was a good man," Hiram said to Samuel, "and whatever Creed did to your family, he has done to a dozen others besides. If your paperwork can stop it, we will sign what you need." The documents they produced were remarkable. original surveys, original correspondence, and, most valuably, a receipt for the water rights payment that had been made to the original grantor 17 years before Creed's deed claimed the rights had been transferred to him. The math was clear and the dates were irrefutable. Samuel spent 2 days with the Coulters, eating their food and sleeping in their spare room, and being quietly overwhelmed by the generosity of people who had no particular reason to help him, except that they understood instinctively what was at stake. He thought about Henrietta in the gray morning light. He thought about the way she had asked him if he was working for Creed, and held his gaze without wavering while she waited for the answer, because she had prepared herself for either possibility, and was not going to look away from the truth, regardless of what it was. He had not met many people in his 31 years with that kind of structural courage, the courage that does not come from the absence of fear but from a decision to act anyway. He had been watching her work for 4 months, not in any sinister sense but in the simple, unavoidable sense that a man watches something that astonishes him, and she astonished him daily. The precision with which she moved through problems. The way she went still when she was thinking, like a hawk hanging on a thermal, all apparent stillness and inner momentum. The fact that she had been carrying this particular crisis on her own, without complaint, without asking for help she had not explicitly determined she needed, since March. He had wanted to say something for weeks. He had not said it because timing mattered, and because he had a practical superstition about declaring himself before he had something concrete to offer, and because he had been carrying his own dark past long enough to know that you do not hand a complicated history to someone in the middle of their crisis and ask them to deal with it. He rode back to Cassidy Creek on Saturday afternoon with the Coulter affidavit secured in his saddlebag. He arrived to find the Langston land office's front window smashed. He was off his horse before it had fully stopped, his hand going to the revolver at his hip, scanning the street with the reflexive caution of a man who had grown up in places where trouble came without announcement. The street was its normal Saturday busy, people moving, wagons rolling, the sound of the saloon 3 doors down already carrying on the afternoon air. Nobody appeared alarmed, which meant this had happened earlier, probably last night. He pushed through the front door, which had been left unlocked. Henrietta was inside. She was sweeping glass from the floor with a broom, her back straight and her movements efficient, and her face set in an expression he recognized as the particular kind of fury she expressed through excessive competence rather than visible anger. She was wearing a dark blue dress and her dark hair was pulled back severely, and there was a small cut on her left hand that she had wrapped with a piece of cloth torn from something. "What happened?" he asked. "Someone threw a rock through my window last night," she said. The night clerk at the hotel across the street heard it around 2 in the morning, but by the time he came out there was no one there. Did they come inside? They did not need to. She bent and collected the larger pieces of glass in a piece of brown paper. They got what they wanted without coming in. A warning, the same as the letter, Creed. Almost certainly, though of course there is no way to prove that directly, which is also by design. She straightened. She looked at him, and for one moment he could see past the efficient anger to the exhaustion underneath it, real and bone deep, and something in him shifted in a way that was permanent and irrevocable. "Did you get the documents?" "I got everything," he said. He set the saddlebag on the desk and opened it. Affidavits from both Hiram and Beatrice Coulter, witnessed by their county clerk. The original water rights receipt predating Creed's deed by 17 years. And a statement from Hiram about the conversation he had with Creed's foreman the year he bought the property, which suggests Creed knew about the conflicting claim when he filed. She took the documents from him, and he watched her go through them with the focused, methodical attention she brought to everything, reading each page fully before turning to the next. Her hands were steady despite the wrapped cut on the left one. She reached the final page and set the stack carefully on the desk and was quiet for a moment. "This is enough," she said. "Combined with what I have, this is enough. I know." She looked up at him, and her expression was doing something complicated that he did not know how to fully read but that he was deeply invested in understanding. "Thank you," she said. And then, with the particular difficulty of someone who does not often ask for help and is therefore not entirely fluent in acknowledging when they have received it, "I did not ask you to do this." "I know that too. Why did you do it?" He had thought about this on the ride back, about how to say it simply and truthfully without making it into something that would complicate the moment or make her feel that his help had come with an unspoken condition. "Because I have been watching this situation for 4 months," he said, "and I have watched you work harder than anyone I have ever known and carry more than anyone should have to carry alone, and because I grew up on the wrong end of what Harlan Creed does to people, and because," he paused, finding the honesty, "because I wanted to." The last 3 words were quieter than the rest, and they both heard them clearly. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who are standing at the threshold of something and are deciding, separately and together, whether to step through. Henrietta Langston was not a woman who made impulsive decisions. She had learned, in 2 years of managing a legal business in a town that took her seriously only when she forced it to, that impulsive decisions were a luxury she could not afford. She also knew the difference between an impulsive decision and a decision she had been making for some time without explicitly acknowledging it, and what she had been making, quietly and without ceremony, over the course of 4 months of gray mornings and strong coffee and arguments about survey methodology, was of the second kind. "The fall term begins in 3 weeks, she said. "We need to be ready." "Then we get ready," he said. They got ready. The 3 weeks before the fall term of the West Texas Circuit Court were the most intensely productive and privately transformative weeks of Henrietta Langston's adult life, and she spent them in a sustained state of barely managed feeling that she refused to examine in any depth until the legal work was done, because she had learned that you could not do 2 enormous things at the same time and do either of them well. They worked from early morning to late evening every day. Samuel had a gift for synthesis, for taking disparate pieces of information and arranging them into a logical structure that was both clear and airtight, and Henrietta had the legal knowledge to identify which of those structures would hold in court and which would not. They argued frequently, productively, in the way of 2 people who respect each other enough to fight honestly. She won most of the arguments about law. He won most of the arguments about spatial logic and the physical evidence from the surveys. They compromised on the strategy for presenting the deed discrepancy, which was the most dangerous part of the case and the one that required the most careful framing. They also, in the margins of all that work, learned each other in the smaller ways. She learned that he drank his coffee without sugar because he had grown up without it, and the habit had stuck. She learned that he had a habit of tapping his pen against his knee when he was thinking that was not irritating the way such habits often are, but was somehow simply the sound of his mind working. She learned that he had a dry, quiet sense of humor that arrived unexpectedly and landed with precision, and that he laughed at her jokes, the actual ones she kept hidden under her professional manner, the ones that required a certain kind of quick intelligence to catch it all. He learned that she was a meticulous reader who never turned a page before she had finished it, which meant that if she turned a page quickly, she was already ahead and was simply confirming. He learned that she made small, absent-minded notations in the margins of her working papers that were not always strictly professional, observations about the absurdity of certain legal precedents, sketched diagrams of the logical structure of arguments, and once, in the margin of a particularly frustrating letter from Creed's lawyers, a sentence in very small handwriting that read, "They are so certain they are right that they have stopped being careful," which was both a legal observation and something more. He learned that she had been close to her father in a way that had left a specific kind of absence, not simply grief, but the loss of the one person who had fully understood what she was doing and why it mattered. He learned this not because she said it directly, but because of the way she occasionally spoke of him in the middle of legal discussions, citing things he had told her, positions he had taken, and the care with which she preserved his handwriting in the original contracts. 10 days before the court date, Creed's lawyers filed a motion to delay the proceedings on technical grounds. It was a standard delay tactic, and Henrietta had anticipated it, and she filed the countermotion the same afternoon with a thorough and politely devastating rebuttal that Judge Harker, a man of 60 who had practiced law in the territory for 30 years and had a limited tolerance for procedural games, denied within 48 hours. 2 days later, Henrietta came into the office to find Samuel already there, which was unusual, with 3 letters spread on his desk and an expression that told her something had shifted. "Creed's foreman was in the telegraph office yesterday afternoon," he said. "Mrs. Carroll at the post office mentioned it to Thomas Birch, who mentioned it to me this morning. Creed is calling in help," she said. "I think he may be. He has lawyers in Fort Worth, serious ones." She sat down and looked at the ceiling for a moment, not with despair but with the focused attention of someone recalculating. If he brings in Fort Worth lawyers at this stage, the judge will want to know why a case of this apparent size warrants that level of representation, which will draw more attention to the deed discrepancy, not less. That was my thought as well. He is trying to intimidate us into withdrawing before the date. Yes, we are not withdrawing. I know, he paused. I also think you should not be alone in this building at night. She looked at him. The broken window was a warning, he said steadily. Creed has been escalating in small increments. I do not believe he will move to direct violence because he is too sophisticated to create a situation where law enforcement must become involved. But I also do not think warnings stop at broken windows. She was quiet for a moment. What are you suggesting? I have a room at the boarding house, but I do not need it every night. I can sleep here in the back room if you have work that keeps you here late. He met her eyes. That is not an improper suggestion. It is a practical one. She held his gaze for a moment that stretched into something neither of them broke. I know the difference, she said, and I appreciate the practical suggestion. He slept in the back room 4 times over the following week, on a folding cot he brought from the boarding house, with his boots on and his revolver within reach and the door between the back room and the main office left open so that any sound from the street would reach him. The arrangement was, as promised, entirely practical. It was also in its small domesticity, something that Henrietta found herself adjusting to with an ease that both surprised and illuminated her. She was not a woman without experience of caring for someone. She had nursed her father through his illness with a steadiness that had cost her a great deal. But this was different. This was not the anxious, backward-looking love of a daughter for a failing parent. This was something that moved forward, something with direction and weight and possibility, and it was both terrifying and the most alive she had felt in 2 years. She did not say any of this. There was work to be done. The night before the court date, they finished the final preparation at 8 o'clock in the evening, and Henrietta leaned back in her chair and allowed herself a full minute of simply sitting there, which was more rest than she had permitted herself in weeks. Samuel was at his desk across the room, organizing the documents for the morning into a precise stack. The lamp between them was warm and steady. Outside, Cassidy Creek had settled into its nighttime sounds. The distant music from the saloon, the occasional horse on the main street, the dry wind off the plains. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "I want you to know that none of this would have been possible without the Coulter affidavits. That was the critical piece." He looked up from the documents. "The critical piece was the deed discrepancy you found before I ever arrived. The deed discrepancy alone is suggestive. The affidavits make it structural. Then we built it together," he said simply. She looked at him across the warm room. She was tired, genuinely, deeply tired in the way of someone who has been running on determination and strong coffee for months, and is beginning to feel the full weight of it. She was also sitting in a room that had been her father's and had become her own and was now, in some significant way theirs, and there was a man across from her who had ridden 40 miles to get evidence for her case, and had slept in her back room to keep her safe, and had been watching her work in the gray early mornings, and had not once in 4 months made her feel that her capability was remarkable rather than simply normal. "Samuel," she said. He waited. "When this is over," she said carefully, "I would like to have a conversation that is not about the case." He was very still for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved in the quiet way it did when something had genuinely reached him. "I would like that too," he said. They blew out the lamp at 9 o'clock, and Henrietta went home to the small house 2 streets over where she had lived her whole life, and Samuel settled onto the cot in the back room, and neither of them slept particularly well, though for somewhat different reasons than purely professional anxiety. The morning of the court date was clear and cold, the first sharp cold of October having arrived overnight to replace the lingering summer heat with something brisk and decisive that seemed appropriate to the occasion. Henrietta dressed with care, choosing the dark wool suit she had ordered from a dressmaker in San Antonio in the spring, and had been saving for a moment that required it. She arrived at the office at 6 in the morning, which was earlier than necessary since the court did not convene until 10, but the idea of waiting in the house had been unbearable. Samuel was already in the office. He had a pot of coffee on the small stove in the back room and 2 cups ready, and the documents organized in the precise order they had established the night before. She accepted the coffee. They looked at each other over the rims of their cups in the gray early light, and the entire accumulated weight of the last 6 months was present in the room with them, and neither of them needed to name it. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," she said. The courthouse was a brick building 3 blocks from the main street, the largest and most solid structure in Cassidy Creek, built with the deliberate solidity of an institution that wanted to communicate that it intended to last. By 9:30, the gallery was nearly full. Word had traveled, as it always does in small towns when something of consequence is about to happen, and the people who had a stake in the outcome, the ranchers along the Cimarron Bluff tract, their families, their neighbors, a dozen people who simply understood that what happened in that courtroom would determine the character of their town for years to come, had come to bear witness. Harlan Creed arrived at 9:45 with 2 lawyers from Fort Worth and 2 men Henrietta recognized as his ranch foremen. He was a big man who had been bigger in his prime, silver-haired and cold-eyed, and dressed in the particular way of a man who wears money as a statement of power. He did not look at Henrietta when he walked past the plaintiff's table. He looked at the room, at the people in it, with the assessing calm of a man who has controlled rooms his entire life and does not expect this one to be different. His lawyers were good. Henrietta had expected that and prepared for it. They were also, as she had noted in their correspondence, supremely confident in a way that had, as she had observed in the margin note, made them stop being careful. Judge Harker called the court to order at 10 o'clock precisely. He was a man of 60 with a gray mustache and a manner that communicated that he had heard every variety of legal argument in the course of his career and was going to hear this one with complete attention and limited patience for anything extraneous. The morning went to preliminary arguments. Creed's Fort Worth lawyers presented their version of the water rights history with smooth, well-rehearsed competence, building a logical structure around the deed that they expected to hold because it had always held before. Henrietta presented the foundational case, laying the groundwork methodically, not yet bringing out the central evidence, establishing the factual record with precision. At noon, Judge Harker called a recess. In the corridor outside, Thomas Birch found Henrietta and pressed her hand briefly and said, "You are doing it exactly right," and she nodded and did not let herself feel anything about that until she had a private moment. Samuel was standing near the window at the end of the corridor, looking out at the main street. She went to stand beside him. "They are not worried," he said quietly. "They have not looked worried all morning. They are not worried because they believe their legal foundation is solid," she said. "They are about to stop believing that. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" She was aware that the question was not exclusively about the case. "I will be," she said. "After." "After," he agreed, and the word carried a future in it that she felt. The afternoon session began at 1 o'clock. Henrietta waited until Creed's lawyers had finished their full presentation of the deed history before she stood and introduced the Coulter affidavits. She presented them with narrative precision, explaining what they established and why they were relevant, watching Judge Harker's face for the moment of recognition. He was a controlled man, not given to visible reaction, but she saw the particular stillness that came over him when he read the date on the original water rights receipt. Then she introduced the deed discrepancy. She did it carefully, without inflammatory language, presenting the evidence as a documentary record and allowing the implications to make themselves. The discrepancy between the original filing date and the date on the deed Creed was using as his foundation. The mathematical impossibility of the claim Creed was making if the original receipt was authentic, which the Coulter affidavits, witnessed by a county clerk, established that it was. Creed's Fort Worth lawyers objected 3 times. Judge Harker overruled twice and sustained once, the one suspension being on a procedural point of no real consequence. The lawyers looked, for the first time all day, genuinely uncertain. Creed himself was very still in his chair. He was not a man who showed fear, and he was not showing it now, but he was showing something else, a recalculation in progress, the face of a man who has been operating on the assumption that a thing is true and has just been presented with evidence that it is not. Judge Harker asked several pointed questions about the deed filing process and the chain of custody of the original documents. Henrietta answered them with complete clarity, referencing the affidavits and the surveyor's records Samuel had provided. At 3:45 in the afternoon, Judge Harker called a brief recess and retired to his chambers. The gallery was very quiet. Thomas Birch was sitting in the second row with his wife Margaret and their 3 children, and Margaret was holding his hand tightly. The other ranchers were similarly still, carrying the specific tension of people whose futures are being decided in a room they cannot enter. Henrietta sat at the plaintiff's table and organized her documents and did not allow herself to speculate, because speculation was not useful and she had done all she could do, and the rest was in the hands of the court. Samuel was seated in the gallery directly behind her. She was not looking at him, but she was aware of him, the way you are aware of a fixed point when you are navigating uncertain terrain. Judge Harker returned at 4:15. His ruling was measured, precise, and thorough, which was consistent with what she knew of him. He found the Coulter affidavits credible and the deed discrepancy materially significant. He found that the foundation of Creed's water rights claim was legally compromised and ordered a full review of the original filing with the county surveyor's office, which meant, effectively, that the claim was suspended pending that review. He also found sufficient basis in the documentary evidence to refer the deed discrepancy to the Territorial Attorney General's office for investigation. He did not rule on the underlying fraud question, because that was beyond the scope of the current proceeding. But the referral made clear what he thought the evidence suggested. For the ranchers along the Cimarron Bluff tract, it meant their water rights were protected while the review was conducted, which meant their land was viable, which meant they could continue operating, which was the immediate and essential thing. For Harlan Creed, it meant that the legal structure he had built his water empire on was under official scrutiny for the first time in his life, and the men he employed knew it, and the town knew it, and the silence in the gallery when the ruling was delivered was the silence of a room absorbing a fundamental change in its landscape. Henrietta sat very still for a moment after the gavel came down. Then she gathered her documents precisely and carefully, because the habit of precision did not stop working simply because the immediate crisis had resolved, and she stood up. Thomas Birch was the first person to reach her. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath for 3 weeks and had just been told he was allowed to breathe again. And when he shook her hand, his grip was so firm it was almost painful, and she did not mind at all. "Miss Langston," he said, and his voice was not steady, "I do not have the words." "You do not need them," she said. Margaret Birch embraced her, which was not entirely expected, and which Henrietta received with a warmth she did not fully manage to contain in her professional bearing. The other ranchers came in turn. She spoke to each of them, answering questions, explaining next steps, being clear about what the ruling meant and what work remained to be done as the review process proceeded. By the time the courthouse had largely cleared, it was past 5 o'clock, and the light outside was going orange and cold. Samuel was waiting on the courthouse steps. He had his hat in his hands, and he was watching her cross the corridor toward him, and she was watching him watch her, and there was absolutely nothing left between them that required explaining. Everything that needed to be said had been said, in the margins of ledgers and the gray pre-dawn light, and the particular silence of a room where two people are working toward the same thing and both know it. She pushed through the courthouse door and stepped into the cold October air. "It held," she said. "It held," he agreed. She looked at him in the clear, failing light, and she allowed herself, for the first time in 6 months, the thing she had been refusing to allow, the full, uncomplicated awareness that she was in love with Samuel Underwood, had been falling into it since approximately the 2nd week of May, and was no longer in any kind of danger from the feeling because it was simply true, and she was not afraid of things that were simply true. "I believe," she said, "that you and I had an agreement about having a conversation that was not about the case." He stepped down 1 step so that his eyes were level with hers. He was very close, close enough that she could see the particular storm-gray quality of his eyes in this light, the lines at their corners from years of squinting against a western sun. "We did," he said. "I am suggesting that we have that conversation now. I was hoping you would say that." And then very simply, very directly, with the same quality of complete honesty that she had come to understand was simply the way he operated in the world. "I love you, Henrietta. I have been loving you since before I knew what to do about it, which is an unusual position for me to find myself in, and I am telling you now because the case is finished, and because I could not have said it honestly while you were carrying all of that and I had not yet made myself useful." She looked at him for a long, warm moment. The wind off the plains pulled at her hair, and the light was going gold around them, and the town of Cassidy Creek moved around them with its ordinary Saturday evening business, entirely unconcerned with the extraordinary private thing that was happening on the courthouse steps. "You have been making yourself useful since April," she said. "You were useful before you went to Marker's Bluff. You were useful every morning you brought coffee, and every night you slept in my back room with your boots on." She paused, and allowed the full simplicity of the next thing she was going to say to arrive without dressing it up. "I love you too. I have been being careful about saying it because being careful is how I survived the last 2 years, and I believe I can stop being quite so careful now." He reached out and took her left hand, the one with the healed cut on it, and held it in both of his, and that was the whole of it, and it was entirely sufficient. The weeks that followed the court ruling were busy in a different way than the weeks that had preceded it, busy with the work of resolution rather than the work of crisis, which has a completely different quality and is considerably easier to live inside. The county surveyor's review of Creed's deed filing was underway, and Henrietta was supporting it with documentation, while simultaneously preparing the official filings to protect her client's water rights during the review period. The Territorial Attorney General's office had sent a letter acknowledging receipt of the referral, which was not action but was the beginning of action, and she had responded with a comprehensive summary of the evidence. Thomas Birch and the other ranchers had begun, quietly and with considerable feeling, to tell their neighbors and associates about what had happened, and there were several new clients who came to the Langston Land office in the weeks after the ruling, ranchers and small business owners who had been operating under constraints imposed by Creed's legal structures, and who wanted to know whether those constraints could be similarly examined. She told them honestly that it would take time, and that not every situation would have the same clear documentary evidence that the Cimarron Bluff case had produced, but that she was willing to look at each case on its merits. The office was fuller and louder than it had been at any point in the 2 years since her father's death, and this was both professionally satisfying and personally sustaining in a way she had not anticipated, but was deeply grateful for. Samuel continued his county survey contract, which ran through the end of the year, and continued to occupy the desk in the corner of her office, and the informal rhythm of their days settled into something that was both more than what it had been and entirely continuous with what it had been, which she found to be the best kind of change. He asked her to dinner 3 days after the courthouse steps conversation, at the hotel restaurant which was the best dining in Cassidy Creek, and she accepted and wore the blue dress that she normally saved for significant occasions because she decided this qualified. They talked for 3 hours over the meal, and not once about surveys or deeds or water rights, but about other things, where they had come from, what they had wanted when they were young, what the country looked like from the particular angle of their separate lives. He told her about growing up on the ranch, about his father's particular quiet dignity in the face of loss, about the years of survey work in New Mexico territory, and what the landscape there had done to his sense of scale. She told him about growing up in the land office, about her father's deep belief that the law was the closest approximation to justice that imperfect people had managed to build, about what it had cost her to maintain that belief in the 2 years since he died. They walked home through the cold October night, and at the door of her house, he held her hand again and she turned to look at him. "I want you to stay in Cassidy Creek," she said. "Not because the survey contract extends through December, but after." "I was planning to," he said. "I was planning to discuss it with you when I thought the timing was right." "The timing is right," she said. He kissed her then, briefly and deliberately, and with the same quality of complete attention that he brought to everything. And it was, she thought, exactly what a first kiss ought to be if both people had been paying attention all along. November came in cold and clean, and with it came 2 pieces of news that arrived within days of each other with the satisfying mutual reinforcement of things that were meant to coincide. The first was a letter from the Territorial Attorney General's office, confirming that a formal investigation into the deed filing had been opened and requesting copies of her documentation, which she provided with meticulous completeness. The second was a visit from Hiram Coulter, who had made the 40-mile trip from Marker's Bluff with his wife Beatrice to see how the case had resolved, and who sat in her office and listened to her account of the ruling, and then was quiet for a long moment, and then said, "Your father would have been very proud," which was the most direct thing anyone had said about her father in months, and which reached her in a way that she was grateful to be sitting down for. She introduced them to Samuel, who shook Hiram's hand with the particular quality of someone greeting a person who matters, and Beatrice Coulter looked between the 2 of them with the perceptive clarity of a woman who has been married for 30 years and knows what she is seeing. "You found each other out here," Beatrice said simply. "That is the best kind of finding." She was not wrong. Harlan Creed, in the weeks following the ruling, was conspicuously quiet. His lawyers had withdrawn from any active role in the water rights cases pending the deed review, and Creed himself had not been seen publicly in Cassidy Creek since the court date. Henrietta was not naive enough to believe this represented genuine acceptance of the outcome. Men like Creed did not accept limitations gracefully, but they also, when they were intelligent, recognized when a situation had become untenable and redirected their energy accordingly. The formal investigation by the Territorial Attorney General made aggressive action against her legally suicidal, and Creed was above all a man who understood his own interests. He sold the northernmost parcel of his land holdings near Marker's Bluff in December, which was the parcel that had been most directly tied to the disputed water rights, and a land agent from Fort Worth came to the Langston office to file the transfer paperwork. It was, as far as Henrietta was concerned, as close to an acknowledgement of defeat as they were going to see, and she processed the paperwork with perfect professional equanimity and felt, privately, deeply satisfied. The survey contract ended at the end of December, and Samuel's formal professional reason for being in Cassidy Creek was therefore concluded. He stayed. He opened a small surveying office in the building next to hers, taking on private survey contracts from ranchers and the county both, and within 2 months it was clear that he had established himself as a reliable and sought-after presence in the region. In January of 1883, on a Sunday afternoon when the sky was pale blue and the cold had gone gentle and the light was crystalline and exact, he asked her to marry him. He did it in her office, because that was where they had spent the most time, and because he wanted her to understand that he was not asking her to become something different from what she was, but to continue being exactly what she was with him beside her. He had, characteristically, also prepared a small speech that covered his intentions and circumstances with the same structural clarity he brought to survey reports, which was both very Samuel Underwood and deeply, unexpectedly moving. He told her that he intended to remain in Cassidy Creek. He told her that he understood the Langston Land Office was her inheritance and her vocation, and that he had no interest in either absorbing it or displacing it, but rather in supporting it as he had been doing and would continue to do. He told her that he loved her specifically, not the idea of her but the actual woman who had been up since before dawn again and again, for 6 months, working through a problem with a determination and a quality of mind that he had never encountered before, and did not expect to encounter again in quite this form. She said yes before he had finished, and then waited politely while he completed the sentence because he had prepared it and it deserved to be finished. And then she stood up and he stood up, and she put her arms around him in the warm lamplight of the office her father had built, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the future was not simply something to be managed but something to be glad about. They were married in February. The wedding was held in the church on the main street of Cassidy Creek, which was a modest building, but was full to capacity because the community had developed a strong and somewhat proprietary affection for the outcome of this particular story. Thomas Birch served as one of the witnesses. Beatrice Coulter had traveled from Marker's Bluff specifically to attend, and she cried during the ceremony with complete absence of embarrassment, which Henrietta found quietly wonderful. Henrietta wore a cream-colored dress that had been her mother's, altered and cleaned, and she carried flowers that Margaret Birch had arranged for her from the hothouse on the edge of town, late winter blooms, small and white and perfectly formed. Samuel wore his good suit and looked at her from the front of the church with an expression that she was glad she had memorized, because she intended to keep it for the rest of her life. The Reverend was a pragmatic man who kept his sermons short, and this was to the wedding's credit. The whole ceremony was compact and clear and meant every word of itself, which suited both of them perfectly. Afterward, the community held a celebration at the hotel that went on longer than originally intended, and involved a great deal of dancing and considerably more general hilarity than the occasion's participants had predicted, primarily because Thomas Birch turned out to be an exceptionally enthusiastic dancer who was not technically accomplished, but was genuinely committed, and because the fiddler the hotel had engaged for the evening had a repertoire that seemed to have no natural end. Henrietta danced 3 times with Samuel, which was more dancing than she had done at any single event in her adult life, and she found, to her surprise, that she was good at it when she was paying attention to something other than the dance itself. They walked home to her house, their house now, through the cold February night, and the town settled behind them into its quiet, and the stars over West Texas were enormous and permanent and entirely indifferent to human happiness, which was fine, because the human happiness in question was self-sustaining. The first year of their marriage was busy in all the ways that first years in small frontier towns in the 1880s were busy, which is to say that there was never a shortage of work, or of the kind of small crises that require immediate practical attention. The territorial investigation into Creed's deed filing concluded in April with a finding that the deed had been materially altered prior to filing, which was the polite legal phrasing for fraud, and Creed was formally charged. He negotiated a settlement through his Fort Worth lawyers that involved significant financial penalties and the revocation of several of his water rights claims. And while this fell short of the full legal consequences that a formal conviction might have brought, it permanently reduced his ability to operate the way he had been operating. More immediately, it meant that the ranchers along the Cimarron Bluff tract had their water rights formally and permanently confirmed. Thomas Birch came to the office the day the confirmation was filed and sat down in the chair across from Henrietta's desk, and for a moment did not say anything at all, and then he said, "My children are going to be able to grow up on that land. Do you understand what that means?" And she said that she did, and she meant it. The Langston land office continued to grow. The new clients who had come in after the ruling became regular clients, and they brought others, and by the middle of 1883, Henrietta had hired a part-time clerk, a young woman named Ruth Ann Carver, who was 17 and capable and fiercely determined to learn everything the office had to teach her. This satisfied Henrietta enormously, both as a practical matter and as a philosophical one, and she taught Ruth Ann with the same deliberate thoroughness with which her father had taught her. Samuel's surveying business was similarly establishing itself, and he had taken on 2 apprentices and was developing a reputation in the region for work that was precise and trustworthy, and that held up when challenged, which in the survey business of West Texas was a reputation worth having. In September, Henrietta told Samuel she was expecting their first child. She told him in the office, because the office was where significant things happened, and he received the information with a stillness that she had learned to read as his full internal attention before the outward response arrived. And then he stood and came around the desk and held her with a care and a joy that was not performative but simply real, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and allowed herself the completeness of the moment. The winter of 1883 was cold and long and full of the specific contentment of a house that is genuinely inhabited by 2 people who have chosen each other. They read in the evenings by the stove, she with her legal correspondence and he with the survey notes he was always revising and organizing, and occasionally one of them would say something that would start a conversation that went for an hour about the law or the land, or the people they had come from, or the country they were living in, and these conversations were among the things she valued most in her life. She worked until she was 8 months along, which was not unusual for women on the frontier in 1883, where the concept of a formal maternity rest period was largely theoretical. Ruth Ann managed more of the daily client work in the final weeks, which she did with a competence that was genuinely impressive for her age. Their son was born in April of 1884, on a morning when the West Texas sky was that specific shade of clear spring blue that looks like something that has been washed and dried in strong wind and hung out to celebrate the occasion. The doctor attended, and Margaret Birch was there, and Samuel was there, which was not always the custom but was, for this particular couple, entirely non-negotiable. They named him George for her father, George Samuel Underwood. When Henrietta held him for the first time, in the afternoon light of the bedroom of the house that had been her parents', and was now hers and Samuel's and would be George's, she felt something that she had not expected, which was that the future had stopped being something you ran toward and had become something you were inside of, which was a completely different and much better feeling. Samuel sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression that Henrietta filed carefully away in the same permanent internal record as his expression in the church doorway. And he said, quietly, "Hello, George." And that was the whole of it. And it was, as it always was with Samuel, entirely sufficient. The spring of 1884 brought two other significant developments. The first was that the Langston Land Office officially became the Langston Underwood Land and Survey Office, a consolidation that made obvious business sense since their work was deeply interconnected, and the clients of one were frequently the clients of the other, but which also mattered in a way that was not purely practical, because it made visible what was already true: that they were not two separate people who happened to work in proximity, but a single working partnership with two deeply complementary capabilities. The sign above the door was repainted. Ruth Ann organized a small, informal gathering in the office to mark the occasion, with cake from the hotel bakery and a general atmosphere of satisfaction. Hiram and Beatrice Coulter sent a letter of congratulations that Henrietta posted on the wall behind her desk. The second development was that Thomas Birch came to the office one afternoon in April with a formal request to have his entire Cimarron Bluff parcel resurveyed, and the boundaries formally registered with the county, which he wanted done before he began the expansion of his ranch operation that he had been planning for 3 years and postponing due to the legal uncertainty. Samuel took the survey contract, and Thomas paid him a fair rate plus a handsome premium that he described, when Samuel protested, as not optional. This survey took several weeks and involved considerable time on horseback across the Cimarron Bluff tract, and Samuel brought Henrietta out on one of the days, on horseback, baby George in a carrier that Samuel had constructed with the same careful attention he brought to all things requiring structural integrity. And they rode across the land that had been at the center of everything and looked at it in the spring light, the creek catching the sun, the grass coming up after winter, the distant line of the bluff against the blue sky. "It is beautiful land," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Your father understood what he was protecting." She looked at the creek and at the bluff and at her husband holding the map of the survey in one hand and the reins in the other with perfect ease, and at her son asleep against Samuel's chest in the carrier, and she thought about the dark past that had brought both of them here, the losses and the threats and the long gray mornings with the candle burned down and the ledger open and the weight of everything pressing. She thought about the letter under the door and the broken window and the months of carrying something that should not have had to be carried alone. She thought about the moment in the gray dawn when he had said, "You have been up since before dawn again," and she had realized he had been watching her work and had felt, simultaneously, exposed and less alone than she had been in years. "I am glad you came to my office," she said. He looked at her with the steady directness that had always been the thing she trusted most about him. "I am glad you let me stay," he said. George stirred and made the small, determined sounds of a person waking up and finding the world interesting, and they turned their horses and began the slow, easy ride back along the creek. And the sun was warm on the spring land, and Cassidy Creek was 2 hours ahead of them, and the life they had built was full and sound, and entirely their own. In the years that followed, the Langston Underwood Land and Survey Office became the most reliable and respected land business in that region of West Texas, known specifically for the quality of its survey work and the thoroughness of its legal documentation, and for a policy of honest representation regardless of whether the client was a large ranch operator or a family of 4 with a single parcel of dry land and a determination to make something of it. This policy was sometimes commercially inconvenient and never morally optional, and both Henrietta and Samuel understood this with equal clarity. Ruth Ann Carver became a full partner in the land business by 1887, having studied law through correspondence courses and self-directed reading with Henrietta's full support, and she eventually became one of the first women in the territory to successfully argue a land case before a circuit court judge, which she did at the age of 23 with a precision and a confidence that Henrietta found entirely predictable and entirely wonderful. Henrietta and Samuel had 2 more children. Their second child, born in 1886, was a daughter they named Clara, for Samuel's mother, a woman he had loved and lost early. Clara Underwood was, from approximately her first hour, a person with strong opinions and a formidable constitution, which everyone who knew her parents found entirely explicable. Their third child, a son born in 1888, they named Robert, which was simply a name they both liked and which suited him perfectly. George, Clara, and Robert grew up in and around the office and the survey workshop, and they understood from early childhood that the land they lived on had been fought for, legally and deliberately, and that the fighting had been worth it. George developed a passion for law that made Henrietta think of her father. Clara developed a passion for mathematics and the precise spatial logic of survey work that made Samuel quietly and enormously proud. Robert was interested in horses and stories, which Henrietta thought was its own kind of gift. In 1889, Texas achieved statehood. The legal landscape shifted, as it always does with such transitions, and there was new work to do in understanding what the changes meant for existing land claims and titles, and Henrietta threw herself into this work with the same quality of attention she had always brought to things that mattered, which was to say the entirety of what she had. The Cimarron Bluff ranchers, including Thomas Birch and his family, had thrived in the years since the ruling. Thomas's oldest son had taken over management of the daily ranch operations, and Thomas himself had shifted into a semi-retirement that involved a great deal of fishing and a surprising commitment to growing roses in his front garden, which he maintained with a devotion that his wife Margaret found endearing, and which produced flowers every summer that she sent to Henrietta with notes in her small, neat handwriting. Harlan Creed died in 1890, one of natural causes, having spent his last years in a substantially reduced financial and social position, as the consequences of the settlement and the investigation reordered the landscape of his influence. Henrietta received the news without satisfaction and without distress, simply noting it as the close of a chapter that had already been finished for several years. The land he had manipulated and taken was slowly, legally, finding its way back to its rightful owners or their descendants through the patient work of the court system, which was slow and imperfect and the best tool available. In the fall of 1891, 9 years after the morning, Samuel had appeared in the doorway of her office and told her she had been up since before dawn again. Henrietta sat at her desk in the late afternoon and looked around the office that her father had built and that she and Samuel had made their own, and that now bore both their names above the door and was full of the evidence of their shared work. The surveys and the plat maps and the legal files and the framed letter from Judge Harker, acknowledging the contribution of the Cimarron Bluff case to the clarity of water rights law in the region, and she felt the particular fullness of a life that has been genuinely lived. Samuel came in from the survey workshop next door, bringing the smell of cold air and horse, and the specific warm scent that she had long since stopped being able to separate from the concept of home, and he sat on the edge of her desk the way he had been sitting on the edge of her desk for years, entirely familiar, entirely present. "George has decided he wants to read law in Austin," he said. "I know. He told me this morning." She looked up at him. "I was awake thinking about it." "Were you up before dawn?" The question carried everything in it, all 9 years, the gray morning and the candle and the ledger and the revelation, and his voice was exactly as it had been that morning, low and certain and carrying the particular quality of a man who has been paying attention. She met his eyes. "I was," she said. He smiled, quietly and with the complete warmth of a man who has been watching someone he loves for 9 years and has not run out of things to see. "Good," he said. "Then we are both awake." She reached up and took his hand, and outside the window of the Langston Underwood Land and Survey office, Cassidy Creek went about its ordinary evening business in the October light, unhurried and alive. And the sky over West Texas was the precise color of everything they had made together, vast and clear, and without a single boundary they had not drawn themselves. George went to Austin to read law and came back 2 years later with a degree and a young woman named Ada who had read law herself, which made Henrietta so happy she cried twice about it privately and was perfectly composed about it publicly, which was exactly the right balance. Clara began correspondence training with a survey firm in San Antonio. Robert turned out to have a gift for writing that surprised and delighted everyone, and he began contributing legal summaries to the regional newspaper, which Ruth Ann told him he had better not let any inaccuracies past him, or she would correct them publicly, which he found, correctly, to be the highest possible professional standard. The house on the 2nd Street of Cassidy Creek, which had been Henrietta's parents' house, and then Henrietta's alone and then theirs, had grown with them. A room added when George was born, another when Clara came, a proper study for Henrietta added in 1887 so she could work at home without the walk to the office on the coldest mornings, a survey library for Samuel built off the back of the house that he and Hiram Coulter had constructed together over a long summer visit. Because Hiram was, it turned out, an excellent carpenter when given adequate materials and a clear plan. The study had a window that faced east, and on the mornings when she was up before dawn, which was still most mornings, because the habit of early work was too deeply embedded to change, even when the urgency that had created it was long resolved, the first light came through that window and made the room warm and golden, and the letters and files and case notes spread across her desk were illuminated by it in a way she had always found specific and beautiful. On one such morning in the spring of 1892, Samuel appeared in the doorway of the study, which he had done 100 mornings before, and he leaned against the frame and looked at her in the early light with an expression that had not changed in its essential quality in all the years she had known him. "You have been up since before dawn again," he said, and the words were the same words they had always been, and they carried in them the whole history of how they had found each other and what they had built, the crisis and the courage and the long gray mornings and the cases won and the life made full and true. She looked up from her work. "I have something to tell you," she said. He came into the room and sat in the chair across from her desk and waited with his characteristic complete attention. "We are going to have another child," she said. The morning light came through the east window and fell across them both, and he looked at her with the expression she had kept in her permanent internal record since the church doorway in February of 1883, and it was exactly the same expression, which was the most wonderful thing about it. "Then we are going to need a bigger survey library," he said, and she laughed, which was also the same, her genuine laugh that she kept hidden under her professional manner and that he had always been able to find. They named their 4th child Helen, for no reason except that the name suited her immediately and completely, which was how the best names work. She was born in October, in the same room where her brothers and sister had been born, and she arrived into a house that was full of people who had been waiting for her with uncomplicated joy. Samuel held her in the afternoon light and spoke to her quietly, as he had spoken to each of their children in their first hours, with the same straightforward honesty and complete attention, and Henrietta lay in the bed with the warmth of the room around her, and the sound of her husband's voice, and the weight of her new daughter's arrival settling into her chest like something that had always been meant to be there. And she knew, with the certainty of a woman who has built something real from the ground up and knows the difference between solid and hollow, that this was the full and permanent truth of her life. Outside the window, the West Texas sky was going from blue to the deep amber of a perfect fall evening. The main street of Cassidy Creek carried its ordinary sounds, horses and wagon wheels and voices, and the distant music of the saloon, the living noise of a town that had been built from determination and argument and sometimes beauty. The sign above the office door a few streets over read Langston Underwood Land and Survey in the letters Samuel had painted himself with the same precision he brought to everything, and the creek ran clear and uncontested to the east, and the Cimarron Bluff stood in the long light of the evening, solid and present and entirely without secrets. Henrietta closed her eyes and listened to her husband's voice and her daughter's breathing and the town outside the window, and she was up since before dawn again in the sense that mattered most, which was that she was fully awake, fully present, fully inside the life she had fought for and found, and she did not intend to sleep through a single moment of it.